From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. In the Treasury, as our first female Chancellor was preparing her first big Commons statement on Monday, our economics editor was down the hall, locked away.
I was bizarrely held up in a room in the Treasury watching it on TV without my phone and my laptop. It was a little bit weird, but they gave us the document with all the costings, which was under embargo. We weren't allowed to report it until Rachel Reeves sat down. So, bit of an odd experience. Would have preferred having my phone and my laptop. I think kettling in journalists and not giving them any access to devices is an interesting social experiment. When she sat down, it was like Lord of the Flies, man. People were just rushing to their phones. It was crazy.
What Rachel Reeves ended up saying has set off a furious row. A day later, she even doubled down, calling her predecessor, Jeremy Hunt, a liar.
Jeremy Hunt covered up from the House of Commons and from the country the true state of the public finances. He did that knowingly and deliberately. He lied, and they lied during the election campaign about the state of the public finances.
He said she was being shameless.
I think it's very disappointing that the new government is choosing to do politics this way. I think it actually discredits politics when people call each other liars. If there's any black hole here, it is because of choices that the new government has made.
Who is right, though? Is this just normal, punchy politics? Or actually has a cover-up within government pushed us further into economic turmoil? And the big question that follows is... The story today. Will Labour raise taxes?
My name's Mehreen Khan and I'm the economics editor at The Times.
What stuck out from you? Because there's so much information. It was an information overload, wasn't it? Of, we're doing this, we're not doing that, we're cutting this. I mean, what jumped out at you?
There was a lot. I think so. A lot of the pre-billing was all about the headline number, the size of the black hole, which I'm going to refer to probably as an overspend in this episode because I think it's maybe a bit more accurate. But we got the number, but then we got loads of other things. We got some sense of where their policy priorities are. And that's not something I was really expecting until the budget. We've heard so much about Labour being asked, but give us the details. What are your plans? What are you actually going to do? They didn't do much pre-election, but 3 weeks into office, they are giving us the policies that, you know, people like me have been craving for so long.
Because just lay this out for us. Yes, there's this overspend that Rachel Reeves has found, is said to be genuinely shocked about and is trying to rectify. But also part of that overspend is decisions she has made. So just sort of set out the situation she finds herself in.
Exactly. So if we start right from the top, Rachel Reeves asked the civil servants to do an audit of the public finances. And actually the number they came up with, the whole or the overspend, was £35 billion. Some of that is money that is probably going to disappear. And so that got whittled down to 22 billion. And then to try and make that as small as possible, Rachel Reeves said that we're going to have to find immediate savings. So things that basically can happen yesterday to make this hole smaller. And she found around 5.5 billion of that to shrink.
And just to be clear, this sort of £35 billion that, as it originally started out, is relating to the financial year that we are currently in. This isn't stuff that might come down the train, you know, in a few years' time. This is what's happening now. Why was some of that stuff that would immediately disappear?
So it's quite technical. There are some things like the government has a rainy day fund, something called a reserve, which was worth about 9 billion, which could be spent to whittle down some of this 35 billion. And then there's just other things that even though the government would have had to pay for, circumstances like the changing of the categories of the spending mean that few of these billions don't ever see the light of day. So we get from 35 to 22 because of those factors. The biggest one being the 9 billion of the rainy day fund.
So this overspend, which Treasury officials combed through all the books and uncovered for Rachel Reeves, was, as you said, originally 35 billion. And then after sort of some of the money of that sort of disappears for various reasons, it shook down to 22 billion. To my mind, that sounds a lot. Is that a lot in the context of government spending, even within just a year?
Short answer is yes, and we know this because Richard Hughes, chairman of the OBR, said that if this 22 billion did materialise, it would have been the single biggest yearly annual spend that the OBR has ever had to record since it was set up in 2010.
Yes, and all of this came from this review that she had Treasury officials do. What did that exactly entail? Where were they finding this information that was unknown to Rachel Reeves beforehand?
So as Shadow Chancellor, as she was for such a long time, even though we all thought she's definitely going to be Chancellor, Rachel Reeves is not in a position where she can ask her future civil servants to do a deep dive into the books, like lay it all bare, right? The first day she comes into office, she suddenly has that power. And so there's an argument now which is raging about whether the civil servants actually always knew the true state of the public finances, including the overspend for this year. They just couldn't reveal it to her. And crucially, they couldn't also reveal it to the Office for Budget Responsibility. And there's now become a little bit of a brouhaha about whether the civil servants were just doing what the ministers told them to do, the ministers being the boss, Jeremy Hunt, or whether there was perhaps some more subterfuge going on. It's fair to say that civil servants are in an incredibly difficult position every time there's a transfer of a government, because they are not allowed to tell their future bosses exactly what they're working on, and they have to wait literally until election day or the day after the election to be given new instructions by their new boss about what the new boss would like from them. So it's always, I think, a bit difficult to lay the blame, I think, on the civil servants. And we heard Rachel Reeves say yesterday that actually civil servants only execute decisions. It's the ministers that make the decisions. And so she's firmly blaming Jeremy Hunt and the Tories for what she calls a cover-up.
Today, I am calling out the Conservatives' cover-up, and I am taking the first steps to clean up what they have left behind. But the scale of the inheritance we have been left means the decisions we have so far announced will not be enough. This level of overspend is not sustainable. Left unchecked, it is a risk to economic stability.
And how much of a cover-up do you think there's been? How much subterfuge actually has been at play? Not just with her, but also the other dynamic in this is the OBR, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, who say that they have been left in the dark about some of this stuff as well.
Yeah, I think so. There was a lot of cynicism going into this sort of audit of the public finances because, you know, the Tories and other people like Paul Johnson, head of the IFS, who is like the Yoda figure of fiscal policy in the UK, he's the kind of lodestar that everyone refers to. They said, look, we know the state of the public finances. We've known for a long time. It's all there in the OBR report. But actually, Rachel Reeves did manage to uncover some genuinely surprising things, including the fact the government was having to spend upwards of £6 billion on hotel costs for people that it was planning to deport under the Rwanda scheme, right? That's something that I think is a huge cost that I certainly wasn't aware of. We haven't reported it. I don't think anyone really knew how much this bill was. And then Rachel Reeves was vindicated really strongly by the fiscal watchdog, the OBR, which put out a letter a few minutes after her statement in the Commons saying that actually it only found out about the state of this overspend a week ago. And the Office for Budget Responsibility, its job is to constantly be auditing the public finances and the policies of the government. The last time the OBR did that was in March. So for the last 4 months, the OBR has also been kept relatively in the dark about the fact that the government had all of these costs, which it didn't tell the OBR about, which would have come into force this year, so 22 billion's worth.
And Jeremy Hunt, now Shadow Chancellor, had a very different view on this, of course.
She says, Mr. Speaker, the information is new. But she herself told the Financial Times, you don't need to win an election to find out the state of public finances, as we've got the OBR now. Paul Johnson of the IFS says the state of public finances were apparent pre-election to anyone who cared to look, which is why he and other independent figures say her argument is not credible and won't wash.
So what is the truth then? Is he right that this is actually as clear as day and Rachel Reeves is being shameless, as he's definitely said, or is she right?
You know, he was in the Commons to hear Rachel Reeves, who was, you know, directly wagging her finger at him, and he was sort of sitting there quite annoyed. And he thinks that she's accusing him of lying, and he's not going to take that lightly. And given he's in opposition, he doesn't have that much else to do. So he's written a letter to Simon Case, head of the civil service, saying that he thinks that Labour have brought the civil service into disrepute for all of the reasons I've just laid out. We're basically implying that there was a cover-up and the civil service was part of this.
So hang on. So a bit like that Spider-Man meme where you've got the two Spider-Mans pointing at each other. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is saying, you, Jeremy Hunt, have brought the civil service into disrepute by having them help you hide all of this stuff. Well, she's not saying that, but that's what the accusation others are putting around. And then Jeremy Hunt is saying, no, you have brought the civil service into disrepute because you're using them to make up the fact that we hid things in the books.
Exactly. So everyone is out here trying to defend the integrity of the civil service, and given the nature of the civil service, they're not allowed to speak. So, okay, who's right? I think, as I've already mentioned, transfers of government, changes of government are very difficult for the civil service. But there are a couple of things that we know, and we know why we've managed to get into this mess. One of them is the fact that we haven't had something called a spending review, which is where the government have to tell us about what exactly they're planning for government departmental spending over future years, often 3 years. We haven't had one of those since the autumn of 2021. I've never even covered a spending review in this job. And so what happened subsequently is that Jeremy Hunt had to come into office. It was kind of an emergency because something called Liz Truss happened to the public finances. And he can, I think, legitimately argue, look, I didn't have time for the spending review because we had to do a lot of patching up on the public finances. So what happens is the OBR is then, every time Jeremy Hunt does a budget, so he would do one almost twice a year, the OBR have to assume that the government is going to hit its departmental spending targets and not exceed them. But it doesn't actually know. So it just kind of assumes. And it's part of this, like, let's assume everything's fine situation that has led us to realizing that actually not everything wasn't really fine. Rachel Reeves has a great answer to this because she's like, guys, I've introduced a bill which would give more powers to the OBR. We're now going to have spending reviews every 2 years, so we're never going to be in this mess again. Labour have a great message. Look, we've come into office. We're going to fix the mess. Jeremy Hunt has a reasonable message. Look, given the situation in which I was taking office, it was hard for me to do the spending review. Cut me some slack. So I think everyone can emerge from this with their heads held up high, which is why I think we're having this kind of storm in a teacup, because everyone can sort of come out of it with a decent, legitimate line.
Yes. Thinking about then what Rachel Reeves has actually said about how she wants to move forward from this, you said that you were sort of surprised about how much policy we got out of the Chancellor. She sort of gave a lot of hints as to how she might manage this problem going forward. I was speaking to her on the radio yesterday morning and put it to her that, you know, with all that's happening, with the spending cuts that she's overseeing and might have to oversee in the future, that she might be an austerity chancellor. And interestingly, she said, no, she is a chancellor of sound money.
It's very important for me that we have sound money, that we have sound public finances. And after the last 14 years of chaos and irresponsibility, I am bringing responsibility back to our public finances and back to public spending. And I began that work yesterday.
Rachel Reeves, Chancellor, good to talk to you this morning. Thank you. Which is sort of conservative language from not that many years ago. What were the kind of whiffs that you were getting from her in terms of where she might take things?
Rachel Reeves actually did make some big decisions on Monday, partly because she already wanted to try and do a bit of the fixing. Two of the biggest things that she announced on Monday, one was that civil servants, teachers, prison officers, doctors, and junior doctors would be getting pay rises. Now, excluding junior doctors because they're in a separate category. If you're a public servant in these sectors, you're going to get a pay rise between 5 to 6%, averaging 5.5%. And that's a recommendation that Labour have wholesale taken on from the pay review bodies. And Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, made it really clear that she thinks this is an important thing to do because we want to end industrial action. We want to end the years of strife between a government and unions over pay. We're going to give them this deal. It's going to cost $9.4 billion. It's important to understand that the black hole figure of 22 billion includes the 9.4 billion from the increase this year in civil service pay. That's an important decision that she's made. It's a very decisive decision that they've made. The 9.4 billion is also not just temporary. It's now going to be a permanent cost on the public finances for the next 5 years. She took that decision. And the other main decision about where she wants to save some money came with pensioners, in particular all pensioners in the UK who receive a winter fuel payment, so money that is given to them directly into their accounts when it gets in the cold months, which is up to £300 if you're over 80, usually £200 if you're over 60. Rachel Reeves is going to introduce means testing, which means that it's only if you get benefits like pension credit that you're going to receive that. So about 10 million pensioners are going to lose their winter fuel payment. That's going to save the government 1.4 billion this year and probably 1.5 billion next year. And it's going to be introduced immediately for this winter. This is a big distributional decision. Rachel Reeves is choosing to take money from pensioners and give it to junior doctors and people in the public sector. That's kind of, maybe we could say, classic Labour politics that she's playing with right now. And so that's why I think, Monday's announcement is much more than just this idea of like there's a hole. She's having to take decisions and she's making choices.
Mehreen, you've been taking us through some of the difficult decisions that the Chancellor has had to make this week. We were just talking about, the cutting of the winter fuel payments for many pensioners, the decision to accept the recommendations of the public pay review bodies, the billions that's going to cost, and then, of course, we've got the pay settlement for junior doctors as well. That's not just the case for this year. This is, as you were saying, baked into future spending as well, where we know there are more black holes, fiscal black holes, for want of a better phrase. What do you think the challenges are for Rachel Reeves as she looks to the future, let alone the problems in the here and now?
They're pretty big. Another thing that she announced in this kind of news-laden statement was that she's going to present her first budget on October the 30th, which is going to be accompanied by this audit from the OBR. And it's also going to include the start of a process to do a spending review, which is going to complete in the spring for the next 3 years. But the budgets for next year are probably going to get announced in the autumn as well. So before any of this black hole debate was around, we already knew that Labour was inheriting a series of spending plans from the Tories, which would imply pretty deep spending cuts for departments that are not protected. So things like local government and the Justice Ministry, so the way that the courts are run. So, Luke, you asked her about whether she wants to be an austerity chancellor or not. In some senses, the fact that she's inherited this, up to £18 billion worth of cuts in public spending would suggest that she has no choice but to be an austerity chancellor unless she chooses not to do this. She made really clear on Monday that she's going to stick to her fiscal rules, which are actually pretty binding on her and quite tight and restrict her room, that the debt target is going to stay where it is. So she's going to accept the Tories' fiscal rules, and she's de facto having to accept the spending plan, which does involve deep, deep cuts for ministerial departments. Add on top of that, this overspend of 22 billion or 16.5 billion, given the savings she's already made. And that's a really difficult fiscal picture.
And so to look at the building blocks of that then, so there's the spending cuts that are already penciled in for departments coming up. There's the fact that she said she can't really borrow much more because, as you mentioned, she's got this fiscal rule, which will mean that she has to get debt falling as a proportion of GDP soonish. That leaves us with tax rises. And yet she's taken a load of those off the table as well. So where's the give in that three-way bit of chess?
So she's made a really clear commitment saying the big three of VAT, income tax, and national insurance are not going to be hiked up. She was also asked very directly yesterday in a press conference whether she thought Jeremy Hunt's second cut to national insurance, which was made in March, was a good idea. And given that the situation is so bad, would she accept that cut? She could legitimately say, I don't want to do it. It wasn't my policy. We're going to not introduce it as planned. She didn't. She said, look, I made the promise. I'm going to accept the national insurance cut. I don't like it, but this is where we are. So those big three are off the table. And now it's left people like me and lots of analysts and lots of economists sort of scrambling around for where there are taxes that Labour could raise and where are the ones where they haven't been so categorical about the fact they're not going to raise them.
Yes. And this is probably the point where pensioners again want to take their headphones off, because we were talking earlier about, the various raids on bits of the public sector that help them. The way pensions are taxed could be a thing that she turns to.
Yeah, I don't know if pensioners wear headphones, but that's a very interesting point.
Big headphones, not like little AirPods.
No, they wear wide ones. I'm
Exactly.
also wearing wide ones because, throwback. You're right. So the way that pension savings are taxed is one potential area Labour could find savings. There are other things that will also disproportionately affect older people, like changes to inheritance tax, the way that capital gains works in this country, which is also something that affects asset-rich parts of the population who genuinely skew towards the older part of the demographic. Labour has ruled out direct wealth taxes, but there is things that they could probably do to properties, particularly second homes or very, very, very ultra high net worth properties, to tax them more, so to give them more stamp duty. So these are already, I think, viable areas for Rachel Reeves to raise taxes, because we've already know that she's kind of already hit pensioners once. It's important to say that Labour will keep the triple lock, which is perhaps the most important policy that affects all pensioners in this country, because it's...
And that's where pensions just... what are the three bits of the triple lock again? I can remember.
So they will rise in line with whatever is the highest from inflation, wages, or 2.5%.
Yeah.
So it's the minimum is always 2.5%. And given inflation has been so high, I mean, the triple lock has been quite an expensive policy for governments in the last couple of years.
So the point is that your state pension could still keep going up in quite a healthy way. But, and just can you explain what these would be for us? How might pensions be taxed differently? And what is the business with how capital gains tax might be tweaked?
Sure. Let's think about capital gains tax, which is a tax which is applied on assets which have a rising value. So when you sell them, they're worth more than whatever you paid for them. Most obvious case, this is on company shares, so equities. It's not on your first home, but it's definitely on your second home, so second properties. And say you want to sell a business, you've made a huge amount of money from your startup, you have to pay capital gains tax. Now, capital gains tax is applied not in the same way that income tax is. So income tax, the top rate is 45%. The top rate for capital gains is 20%. So there's been long-standing calls among sort of progressive parts of the Labour Party and among some economists to align capital gains and income tax. So the top rate of income tax is 45%, the top rate of capital gains. So if you're the richest person who has to pay income tax of 45%, you also pay the same rate on capital gains. So you don't get this kind of discount. This would be a really good way to simplify the tax system. This could, according to an estimate from the government's own body, the Tax Simplification Office, raise about £14 billion a year for a government if they want to do this, which is a huge amount. Like, it would probably, that black hole would be a black thimble if this happened. But we should caveat this with the fact that if this change is introduced, Labour would do other things to probably make sure that it's not so penalising for people, including indexing with inflation the price of the asset. So when you sell the asset, you have to take into account inflation and the changes that inflation have wrought on that.
Yes.
So 14 billion probably won't be that much, but it's still a decent sum. It would probably be the biggest single change that Rachel Reeves could introduce if she wants to align income tax and capital gains together. I think she has to now be a little bit careful, because they have to make sure that they're not being so egregiously targeting of older and wealthier people.
And if they're trying to be less egregious with it, then what are the sneaky ways of getting some cash into the coffers? You're always very good at, different ways, different hands can go down different bits of the back of the Treasury sofa. What's sort of attracting you at the moment that would be a good, healthy way of getting some money in, which, we might not have considered and might not annoy anybody?
Yeah, I mean, so I've written a lot about the ways Labour can generate money without saying that we're imposing a tax. Sadly for me, despite advocating for a lot of this stuff, it doesn't look like Labour wants to, at least has any immediate plans to do them. One that I've written about this week is about tariffs.
What do you mean by tariffs?
A tariff is a tax basically on an import from a foreign country. And we're talking a lot about tariffs now because Donald Trump, who might be US president in a couple of months, loves tariffs. He's even proposed this idea that he would basically abolish income tax in the US, so nobody pays income tax, because of the amount of money that could be generated from taxing foreign imports from all of the US's trading partners, but notably on China, who he wants to hit with a flat 60% tariff on anything Chinese that comes across a US customs border. So basically a customs tax. There are various reasons why you would do it. For Donald Trump, it's not just money raising, it's more part of a foreign policy. But we know that other countries like those in the European Union have started hitting tariffs, particularly on Chinese-made electrical vehicles. Labour has already said that it's not going to be doing that. So it's not going to follow its EU partners, and it's not going to follow the Biden administration, who've also done this, because the UK still believes in free trade and it doesn't want to go down the route of protectionism. So even though other countries are getting some money from tariffs, Britain for now is saying no to the tariff option. Then there are other things that I've spoken about, which I think is something she could still pull out of the bag. It's not a tax and it's not a way to change anything substantive, but it's a way to change the way that the debt rule, which she's applied on herself, is measured. And this would be a shift which changes the way that we measure public sector debt to include things like losses made by the Bank of England. And even though that sounds terrible, it would actually be a change that on paper would give her a little bit more breathing space, perhaps, again, up to 10 billion.
And by breathing space, you mean it would allow her to borrow more, where previously she'd come up against this rule that she set herself to get debt falling?
Yeah, the fiscal room or the breathing space always talks about the room that she has against her own fiscal rule. So she's given herself a fiscal rule, the main one of which is to get the debt falling within a 5-year rolling period. That's going to be really, really hard. So I think the temptation of changing the measurement of the debt becomes much more seductive. The shadow Chancellor Jeremy Hunt asked her explicitly at the dispatch box on Monday whether she was going to make this change. Rachel Reeves sort of fluffed the answer, but we know that it's one of the things in the realm of possibility. Yeah. And honestly, people will not feel the change, but it will give her a bit more of a honeymoon period in her first year, which is already looking seriously tough. Yeah. And I've spoken to economists and people who work in the markets. They wouldn't be too worried about this as a kind of changing of the goalpost moment. They're not so scared of the fact that we could change the debt measure, because they realize that in politics, you kind of sometimes have to do sneaky things like this.
Yes, and it wouldn't spook them in a kind of Liz Truss kind of way.
No.
Just to end with then, Mehreen, can we just be a bit selfish about all of this? If the person listening to this is just wondering, after all of that shakes down, are Labour going to put up my taxes in this Parliament? It sounds like you're suggesting the likely answer is yes, at some point, maybe.
Yeah, depending on who you are, and that's going to be quite a broad swathe of the population, I think it's fair to say the answer is yes. Are they going to be putting up your income tax, your national insurance, or your VAT? No, but are they going to find other ways they could potentially tax people and businesses and non-doms and private schools and all the other things that we already know about? The answer is going to be yes. And we spoke before the election about the sense, I think, in which Labour, it's in their interest to create a sense of emergency around the public finances, because in year one in office, you can do things which, are built on the strong mandate that you have, and then hope that over the years, as you get, through your political cycle, you don't have to make so many tough decisions. It's probably better to take them at the beginning and then hope that the economy starts growing, that investment gets up, that the growth miracle manifests itself, materializes, and then everyone will forget about what you did in the first 3 months in office. That's where we are with the public finances. They have ended up being, as Rachel Reeves may have predicted, worse than she expected. And that means the budget on October the 30th and the accompanying spending review for next year is going to be much trickier than we would have thought. And in some senses, if you were speaking to Tory ministers a few months ago, earlier this year, we sort of knew that they were going to hand this, I don't want to swear on this podcast, but a bad sandwich to the incoming Labour government. We've spoken so much about the fiscal inheritance, and here it is laid bare.
A bad sandwich, delicious. Mehreen, thank you.
Is it shit sandwich? I can't say that, can I?
Mehreen Khan, The Times' economics editor. Today's producers were Taryn Siegel and Olivia Case. The executive producers are Kate Ford and Fiona Leach. Sound design and theme composition was by Maula Seto. There is a lot that the Labour teams in the Treasury and Number 10 will have to think about. If you enjoyed this episode, you might like our previous one on Starmer's top advisors. We'll pop a link to that in the description for this episode. Leave us a review wherever you're listening to us, and you can get in touch anytime if you like. story@thetimes.com is where you'll find us. I'm Luke Jones. Thanks for listening.